The clock on the wall showed 6:30 p.m. as Robert Williams pushed his cleaning cart down the marble hallway of Riverside Academy. His footsteps echoed softly in the empty corridor, the only sound breaking the peaceful silence that always settled over the school after the last student had gone home. At 58 years old, Robert had been walking these same hallways for 15 long years, and he knew every corner, every crack in the wall, every squeaky floorboard by heart. Riverside Academy wasn't just any school. It was the kind of place where parents paid more in a single year than most people made in 5. The hallways were lined with portraits of famous graduates who had gone on to become senators, business moguls, and celebrities. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceilings, and the floors were made of imported Italian marble that Robert polished until it gleamed like a mirror. But Robert didn't mind the fancy surroundings. In fact, he had grown to love this place, even though he knew he would always be invisible to the students and teachers who walked past him every day. To them, he was just the quiet janitor who emptied their trash cans and mopped their floors. They never bothered to learn his name or ask how his day was going. He was part of the background, like the paintings on the walls or the expensive furniture in the lobby. Tonight felt different, though. There was something in the air that made Robert feel restless as he made his way toward the music hall. Maybe it was because tomorrow marked exactly 15 years since he had started working here. Or maybe it was the way the evening light was streaming through the tall windows, casting long golden shadows across the floor. Whatever it was, Robert found himself walking a little slower than usual, taking in the details of a place that had become his second home. The music hall was Robert's favorite room in the entire academy. It was a massive space with soaring ceilings and perfect acoustics that made even a whisper sound beautiful. Rows of chairs faced a small stage where a magnificent black grand piano sat like a crown jewel. The piano was a Steinway, worth more money than Robert would see in a lifetime, and it was the pride and joy of the music department. As Robert pushed open the heavy wooden doors, he could still smell the faint scent of rosin and sheet music that seemed to live permanently in the air. During the day, this room was always filled with the sounds of students practicing their scales, teachers giving lessons, and the occasional concert that made Robert stop his work just to listen from the hallway. But now, in the quiet of the evening, the room felt almost sacred. Robert began his usual routine, emptying the small trash cans that sat near each row of chairs, picking up the bits of paper and pencil erasers that students always seemed to leave behind. He moved methodically, the way he had learned to do everything in his life, steady, careful, and thorough. As he worked his way toward the front of the room, Robert noticed that someone had left the piano open. The lid was raised, exposing the beautiful black and white keys that seemed to glow in the soft evening light coming through the tall windows. Usually the piano was closed and locked after lessons, but today the music teacher must have forgotten. Robert set down his dust cloth and moved closer to the instrument. He had always been fascinated by this piano, not just because of its obvious beauty and value, but because of the magic that seemed to flow from it when skilled hands touched its keys. He had heard countless students play over the years, some good, some not so good, but all of them creating something that filled the empty spaces in his heart. Standing next to the piano, Robert could see his reflection in the polished black surface. His face was weathered and lined, his hair more gray than brown now, and his hands showed the calluses and small scars that came from years of hard work. He looked like exactly what he was, a working man who had spent his life cleaning up after other people, but as he stood there, something stirred inside him that he hadn't felt in a very long time. It was a feeling he had tried to bury so deep that he sometimes forgot it was still there. His eyes moved from his reflection to the keys of the piano, and almost without thinking, he reached out and gently touched one of the white keys, the single note that rang out was pure and clear, hanging in the air like a perfect crystal bell. Robert felt a shiver run down his spine as the sound slowly faded away. He looked around the empty room, making sure he was still alone, then reached out and touched another key, and then another. He knew he shouldn't be doing this. The students and teachers made it very clear that this piano was not for people like him. He had heard them talk about how expensive it was, how only trained musicians should touch it, how even the wrong kind of cleaning product could damage its perfect finish. But standing there in the golden evening light, Robert couldn't bring himself to walk away. His right hand found its way to the keys, and almost as if it had a mind of its own, began to pick out a simple melody. The notes flowed together in a way that made Robert's heart ache with a pain so sweet it was almost unbearable. It had been so long since he had touched a piano, so long since he had allowed himself to remember what it felt like to create music instead of just listening to it from a distance. The melody grew more complex as Robert's fingers remembered movements they hadn't made in years. His left hand joined his right, and suddenly the simple tune became something richer, fuller, more complete. The music filled the empty room and seemed to bring it to life in a way that all the expensive decorations and fancy furniture never could. For a few precious moments, Robert forgot where he was and who he was supposed to be. He forgot about the cleaning cart waiting in the hallway and the trash cans that still needed to be emptied. He forgot about the uniform he wore and the way people looked right through him as if he didn't exist. In those moments, he was just a man making music, and the world felt right again. The song he played was one he had learned long ago, in a different life that sometimes felt like it had happened to someone else entirely. It was a gentle piece, not flashy or complicated, but filled with emotion that seemed to pour out of his fingers and into the keys. As he played, Robert could feel tears starting to form in his eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of joy, of remembering, of coming home to a part of himself he had thought was lost forever. The beautiful melody was still floating through the air when Robert heard the heavy wooden doors of the music hall creak open behind him. His hands froze above the keys as if he had been caught stealing something precious. The silence that followed felt deafening after the gentle music that had been filling the room just seconds before. "What do you think you're doing?" The voice was sharp, cold, and filled with the kind of authority that only comes from a lifetime of getting exactly what you want. Robert turned around slowly, his heart sinking as he saw who had caught him. Standing in the doorway was Victoria Ashford, 17 years old and every inch the princess of Riverside Academy. Victoria wasn't just any student. She was the granddaughter of the man who had founded the school 50 years ago, and she never let anyone forget it. Her family name was carved in marble above the main entrance, and her picture would probably hang in the hall of famous graduates someday. She had long blonde hair that always looked perfect, wore clothes that cost more than Robert made in a month, and carried herself like she owned the world, and maybe she did own this little corner of it. "I asked you a question," Victoria said, stepping into the room with the confident stride of someone who had never been told no in her entire life. "What are you doing touching my piano?" Robert's mouth went dry. He tried to find words, any words, that might make this situation better, but his mind seemed to have gone completely blank. The magic of the moment was gone, replaced by a cold fear that started in his stomach and spread through his entire body. I was cleaning, and I noticed it was open," Robert stammered, taking a step back from the piano as if it might bite him. "I didn't mean any harm. I was just ... Just what?" Victoria's eyes narrowed as she looked him up and down, taking in his simple work clothes and the cleaning cart he had left by the door. "Just decided you could put your dirty hands all over a piano that's worth more than you'll make in your entire pathetic life?" Robert felt his face burn with shame. He had known this moment would come eventually, had always known that someone would catch him and remind him of his place. But somehow, hearing it said out loud made it hurt worse than he had expected. I'm sorry," he said quietly, backing toward his cleaning cart. "I'll just finish up and get out of your way." But Victoria wasn't done with him yet. She pulled out her phone and started recording, holding it up so that Robert was clearly visible on the screen. A cruel smile spread across her face as she realized what a perfect opportunity this was. "Oh no, you're not going anywhere yet," she said, her voice taking on the tone of someone who had just discovered the most entertaining thing in the world. "This is too good to waste. Look everyone, I caught the janitor thinking he could play piano." Robert watched in horror as Victoria typed something on her phone, and within seconds he could hear footsteps in the hallway outside. She had sent a message to her friends, probably telling them to come see the show she was about to put on. The first to arrive was Brian, Victoria's boyfriend and the star of the Academy's football team. He was followed by Ashley, the head cheerleader, and then by 3 more students whose names Robert didn't know but whose faces he recognized from the hallways. They all had their phones out, recording, and they were all looking at Robert like he was some kind of strange animal in a zoo. "You guys are not going to believe this," Victoria announced to her growing audience. "I came back to get my sheet. Music, and found the janitor here playing my grandmother's piano with his gross, dirty hands." The group of teenagers laughed, and Robert felt smaller with each sound. He tried again to move toward his cart, but Victoria stepped in front of him, blocking his path to the door. "Where do you think you're going?" she asked, her voice loud enough that Robert was sure people in the hallway could hear. "You can't just touch other people's things and then run away when you get caught." "I wasn't trying to steal anything," Robert said, hating how weak his voice sounded. "I was just looking at it. I didn't hurt anything." "Looking at it?" Victoria's laugh was sharp and mean. "That's not what I saw. I saw you playing it like you thought you actually knew how. Like you thought you deserved to touch something so beautiful and expensive." Brian stepped forward, his phone camera pointed right at Robert's face. "Dude, did you really think you could play piano? That's hilarious. What's next? Are you going to tell us you're secretly a doctor or a lawyer too?" The group laughed again, and Robert felt his cheeks burning with embarrassment. He had spent 15 years being invisible in this place, and now suddenly he was the center of attention in the worst possible way, Ashley chimed in, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Oh my gosh, Victoria, you should totally post this online. Can you imagine? Janitor thinks he's Mozart. It would go viral for sure." Victoria's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "That's actually a great idea. I bet people would love to see this. A janitor who thinks he's good enough to touch a Steinway." She turned the camera back to Robert, zooming in on his face. "Say hi to the internet, piano man." Robert felt trapped, surrounded by these young people who seemed to take such joy in his humiliation. He thought about the beautiful music he had been making just minutes before, and it seemed impossible that something so pure and perfect could exist in the same world as this cruelty. "Please," he said quietly, looking directly at Victoria. Sorry I touched your piano. It won't happen again. Can I just go back to work now?" But Victoria was enjoying herself too much to let him off that easily. She had an audience, and she was performing for them like she was on stage. Work? This is the most interesting thing that's happened all week. Besides, I want to make sure you understand why what you did was so wrong." She walked over to the piano and ran her hand lovingly along its polished surface. "This piano belonged to my grandmother. It's been in my family for 3 generations. I've been taking lessons since I was 4 years old, and I practice on this piano every single day. It's not some toy that anyone can just walk up and play with." Robert nodded, understanding flooding through him. Of course the piano meant something special to her. Of course she would be protective of it. He should have thought about that before he let his emotions get the better of him. "I understand," he said. "I really am sorry. I know I shouldn't have touched it." Victoria looked at him for a long moment, and for just a second Robert thought maybe she was going to let him go. But then her expression hardened again, and he knew his ordeal was far from over. Victoria walked around the piano slowly, like a lawyer circling a witness in a courtroom. Her phone was still recording, and Robert could see the red light that meant his humiliation was being captured for the whole world to see. The group of students had grown larger now, with more kids appearing in the doorway to see what all the excitement was about. "You know what really bothers me?" Victoria said, her voice carrying that fake sweetness that made Robert's skin crawl. "It's not just that you touched my piano without permission. It's that you clearly think you're good enough to play it." She stopped right in front of Robert and looked him up and down again, making sure her camera caught every detail of his embarrassed face. "I mean, look at yourself. Look at your hands. Those are working hands, not musicians' hands. Those are hands that clean toilets and mop floors. Robert looked down at his hands without thinking and immediately wished he hadn't. Victoria was right, of course. His hands were rough and calloused from years of hard work. His fingernails were clean but short, and there were small scars and cuts that came from handling cleaning chemicals and moving heavy equipment. They weren't the soft, pale hands of someone who spent their days making beautiful music. But here's what I find really funny, Victoria continued, and Robert could hear the excitement building in her voice. She was enjoying this more and more with each passing minute. You were actually moving your fingers like you thought you knew what you were doing. Like you actually believed you could make real music. Brian laughed from somewhere behind her. Maybe he watches YouTube videos of people playing piano and thinks that makes him a musician. Or maybe he thinks because he hears music in here all day, some of it just magically rubbed off on him, Ashley added, and the whole group burst into laughter. Robert felt something hot and bitter rising in his chest. It wasn't anger exactly, because he had learned long ago that anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. It was something deeper than that, something that felt like a lifetime of being invisible and ignored and treated like he didn't matter. You know what? Victoria said suddenly, and her voice changed in a way that made Robert look up at her face. There was a new kind of gleam in her eyes, the look of someone who had just thought of something particularly entertaining. I have an idea. Since you clearly think you're some kind of piano player, why don't you prove it? The room got quiet in a way that felt dangerous. Robert could feel all the eyes on him, could hear the soft sounds of phones being held up to record whatever was about to happen. His heart started beating faster, and his mouth felt dry as dust. What do you mean? He asked, though he was pretty sure he already knew what she meant. Victoria gestured toward the piano with a grand sweep of her arm. I mean, play something, right now. For all of us, show us what you've got. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge, and Robert could see the exact moment when all the other students realized what Victoria was suggesting. Their faces lit up with anticipation like they were about to watch the most entertaining show of their lives. Oh my God, yes, Ashley squealed. Make him play something. This is going to be so good. I bet he can't even find middle C, Brian said. Laughing so hard he could barely get the words out, Victoria held up her hand for quiet, but she was smiling the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. Now, let's be fair. Maybe he actually can play. Maybe we've been underestimating our friend here. She turned back to Robert, and her voice took on that fake sweet tone again. So what do you say, Robert? That is your name, right? I see it on your name tag. Are you going to show us what you can do, or are you going to admit that you had no business touching my piano in the first place? Robert felt trapped. If he walked away now, he would look like exactly what they thought he was, a foolish old man who had gotten caught pretending to be something he wasn't. But if he tried to play and failed, if his hands shook or he forgot the notes or made mistakes, it would be even worse. They would have proof that he was nothing but a janitor who had ideas above his station. I don't think that's a good idea, Robert said quietly, trying to edge toward his cleaning cart again. I should really get back to work. There are still rooms I need to clean before I can go home. But Victoria stepped in front of him again, blocking his path with her whole body this time. Oh no, you're not getting out of it that easily. You made your choice when you decided to touch my piano. Now you need to face the consequences. She turned to face her audience, playing to them like she was performing on stage. Don't you think it's only fair? If he's going to act like he belongs here, like he has the right to use our instruments, shouldn't he prove that he deserves it? The group of students cheered their agreement, and Robert could see more faces appearing in the doorway. Word was spreading through the school that something interesting was happening in the music hall, and kids were coming to see the show. Come on, Robert, Victoria said, turning back to him with that cruel smile still plastered on her face. Don't be shy, we're all friends here. Just play us a little something. It doesn't have to be complicated. Maybe Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star that seems about your level. The group erupted in laughter again, and Robert felt his face burning with shame. But underneath the embarrassment, something else was stirring. It was the same feeling he had experienced earlier when he had been playing alone in the peaceful quiet of the evening. It was the feeling of music calling to him, reminding him of who he used to be before life had beaten it out of him. "What's the matter?" Victoria pressed, sensing his hesitation and moving in for the kill. "Having second thoughts? Realizing that touching a real piano isn't the same as whatever you do when nobody's watching?" She leaned closer to him, close. Enough that her voice was almost a whisper. "Here's the deal, Robert. Either you play something right now, or I'm going to post this video online with a caption about how the janitor at Riverside Academy thinks he's too good for his job. I'm going to make sure everyone sees how you disrespected my family's piano." Robert looked at her face and saw that she meant every word. This wasn't just teenage cruelty anymore. This was someone with real power threatening to destroy what little dignity he had left. She could ruin his reputation, maybe even cost him his job. All it would take was one viral video, and his quiet, invisible life would be over. But as he stood there, trapped between the piano and a crowd of laughing teenagers, something unexpected happened. The fear that had been growing in his chest started to transform into something else. It was still fear, but it was mixed with something that felt almost like relief. For 15 years he had hidden who he really was. For 15 years he had pretended that the music inside him didn't exist. Maybe it was time to stop pretending, Robert looked at Victoria, then at the piano, then back at the crowd of students who were all waiting to see him fail. He took a deep breath and felt something settle into place inside him, something that had been broken for so long he had forgotten it was there. "All right," he said quietly, his voice steady for the first time since Victoria had walked into the room. "I'll play something for you." The words hung in the air like a promise, and Robert could feel something shifting inside him. It was as if a door that had been locked for 20 years was finally creaking open. The fear was still there, but it was being pushed aside by something much stronger, something that felt like coming home. Victoria's smile got even wider when she heard his answer. She was sure she had won, sure that she was about to witness the most entertaining humiliation of her teenage life. She held her phone higher, making sure she caught every angle as Robert walked slowly toward the piano. "This is going to be so good," she whispered to Ashley, loud enough for Robert to hear. "I can't wait to see his face when he realizes he can't actually play." The crowd of students pressed closer, their phones all pointed at Robert like weapons. Someone had started a live stream, and Robert could see the viewer count climbing as word spread through social media. In a few minutes, hundreds of people would be watching whatever was about to happen. Robert reached the piano and stood in front of it for a moment, and just looking at the keys. They seemed to glow in the soft light, black and white patterns that had once been as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. His hands were trembling slightly, and he could feel sweat on his forehead despite the cool air in the room behind him. He could hear Victoria's voice, loud and mocking. "Take your time. Robert, we've got all night. Though maybe you should wipe your hands first? We wouldn't want you to get the keys all gross and sweaty." More laughter from the crowd, but somehow it seemed farther away now, like it was coming from another room. Robert pulled out a clean cloth from his back pocket, the same cloth he used to dust furniture, and carefully wiped his hands. Then he sat down on the piano bench, his back straight, his feet positioned exactly the way he had been taught so many years ago. "Oh, wow, he actually knows how to sit at a piano," Brian called out. "Maybe he really has been watching those YouTube videos." Robert ignored the comment and placed his hands gently on the keys. For just a moment, he closed his eyes and let himself remember what it felt like to be the person he used to be. He could almost hear his old teacher's voice in his head, reminding him to breathe, to relax his shoulders, to let the music flow through him instead of trying to force it. When he opened his eyes again, something had changed in his face. The fear was still there, but it was mixed with something that looked almost like peace. He looked out at the crowd of students, and for the first time since Victoria had walked into the room, he smiled. "I'm going to play something for you," he said, his voice calm and steady. "It's a piece by Chopin. It's called Ballade No. 1. Victoria's expression flickered for just a second. She knew that peace It was one of the most difficult compositions in the classical piano repertoire. Even she, with all her years of expensive lessons, could only play parts of it. But then she shook her head and laughed. "Oh, please," she said. "That's one of the hardest pieces ever written. If you think you can fool us by just naming some famous song, you're even dumber than I thought." Robert didn't answer. Instead, he took a deep breath and let his fingers find their home on the keys. The first notes were soft, almost hesitant, like a question being asked in a whisper. But even those gentle sounds were perfect, each note clear and pure, with exactly the right touch and timing. The crowd of students stopped laughing, though they didn't quite know why yet. Then Robert's left hand joined his right, and suddenly the simple melody became something richer and more complex. The music began to build layer upon layer, like a story being told in a language that everyone could understand but nobody could speak. Victoria's smile started to fade. She knew music well enough to recognize skill when she heard it, and what was coming from the piano was definitely skilled. But this was just a janitor. This was just some old man who cleaned bathrooms and emptied trash cans. He couldn't possibly be playing Chopin like this. As the piece continued, Robert seemed to transform before their eyes. His shoulders relaxed, his face became peaceful, and his hands moved across the keys with a confidence that made it look easy. But everyone in the room could tell that what he was doing was anything but easy. The melody soared and dipped, sometimes gentle as a lullaby, sometimes powerful enough to fill the entire hall. Robert's fingers danced across the keys, finding notes that seemed impossible to reach, creating harmonies that made the hair on the back of people's necks stand up. Ashley lowered her phone without realizing she was doing it. Her mouth was hanging open, and she kept blinking like she couldn't believe what she was seeing. "Is he really playing that?" She whispered to no one in particular. Brian had stopped laughing completely. He was staring at Robert with the same expression he might have if he had just watched someone perform magic. "How is he doing that?" he asked, but nobody answered because nobody knew. The music grew more intense, more passionate, and Robert seemed to disappear into it completely. His eyes were closed again, and there was an expression on his face that was almost like joy, but deeper than that. It was the look of someone who had found something they thought was lost forever. Victoria was no longer smiling. She was holding her phone, but she had forgotten she was recording. Her face had gone pale, and she was staring at Robert like she was seeing a ghost. She knew this piece inside and out, had struggled with it for months with her expensive private teacher. But the way Robert was playing it made her own attempts sound like a child banging on pots and pans. The crowd of students had grown completely silent. Some of them were still recording, but most had lowered their phones and were just listening. Really listening, maybe for the first time in their lives? The music was washing over them like waves, carrying them to places they had never been. As the piece reached its climax, Robert's whole body seemed to be involved in the music. His hands flew across the keys with impossible speed and precision, creating cascades of notes that somehow all fit together perfectly. The sound filled every corner of the room, bouncing off the walls and ceiling and wrapping around everyone present like a warm blanket. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the music started to wind down. The powerful chords gave way to gentler passages, and finally to the same soft, questioning notes that had started the piece. Robert played the final note and let it hang in the air, his hands still resting on the keys, his eyes still closed. The silence that followed was complete. Nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed to breathe. The echo of the last note faded away slowly, leaving behind a quiet that felt sacred. Robert opened his eyes and looked out at the crowd of students. Their faces had completely changed. Where there had been cruel laughter and mocking smiles, now there was only shock, confusion, and something that might have been respect. Victoria was the first to find her voice, though when she spoke, it came out as barely a whisper. "How did you ... Who are you?" Robert sat quietly at the piano for a long moment, his hands still resting on the keys. The question Victoria had asked hung in the air between them, and he could see the confusion and shock written across every face in the room. These young people had expected to see him fail, to confirm everything they believed about who he was and what he was worth. Instead, they had witnessed something that didn't fit into any of the boxes they had built for him. He turned around on the piano bench to face them, and for the first time in 15 years, Robert felt like himself again. The man who had been hiding inside him for so long was finally ready to come out. "My name is Robert Williams," he said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "But 25 years ago, people knew me as Robert Williams Clark?" Victoria's eyes widened. Something about that name sounded familiar, but she couldn't quite place it. Several of the other students looked confused, clearly not recognizing the name at all. Robert smiled gently, understanding their confusion. "I don't expect you to know who that is. It was a long time ago, and classical music isn't exactly popular with teenagers these days." He stood up from the piano bench and walked a few steps toward them, no longer the invisible janitor they had been mocking just minutes before. There was something different about the way he held himself now, something that commanded attention and respect. 25 years ago, I was a concert pianist," Robert continued. "I had just graduated from the Manhattan School of Music, and I was starting to make a name for myself. I had played with several orchestras, and I was scheduled to perform at Lincoln Center." Ashley's mouth fell open. "Lincoln Center? That's huge," Robert nodded. It was everything I had ever dreamed of. Music was my whole life. I had been playing piano since I was 4 years old, practicing hours every day, sacrificing everything else for the chance to share beautiful music with the world. Victoria was staring at him like she was seeing a completely different person. But you're a janitor. How did you go from being a concert pianist to—" Her voice trailed off as she realized how cruel the question sounded, but Robert didn't seem offended. Instead, he looked sad in a way that made Victoria's chest feel tight. "Life has a way of changing your plans," Robert said softly. 22. Years ago, I was driving home from a performance in Boston. It was late, it was raining, and I was tired. A drunk driver ran a red light and hit my car. The room got even quieter, if that was possible. Robert held up his left hand, and for the first time, the students noticed the scars that ran across his knuckles and the way his ring finger sat at a slightly odd angle. "The doctors did their best," Robert continued, "but some of the damage was permanent. My left hand would never be quite the same. For a classical pianist, that might as well be a death sentence." Brian shifted uncomfortably. "But you just played that whole piece. Your hand seemed fine." Robert smiled, but it was a sad smile. "I can still play, obviously, but not the way I used to. Not well enough for the professional world, where perfection is the only thing that matters. I tried to come back, spent 2 years in physical therapy, practiced until my fingers bled. But I could never quite get back to where I was." He walked over to the window and looked out at the empty parking lot. "When you've defined yourself by one thing your whole life, and then that thing is taken away from you, it's hard to figure out who you're supposed to be." "I was lost for a long time." Victoria felt something uncomfortable stirring in her chest. It might have been guilt, but she had never really experienced that emotion before, so she wasn't sure. "So you became, you took this job?" "I needed work," Robert said simply. "And I wanted to stay close to music, even if I couldn't perform anymore. This job let me be around pianos and musicians every day. I could listen to lessons and concerts, and sometimes when nobody was around." He gestured toward the piano, and everyone understood what he meant. "I would play for myself, just to remember what it felt like to make music again." Ashley wiped her eyes, surprised to find that she was crying. "That's so sad. You gave up your whole career?" Robert turned back to face them, and his expression was thoughtful. "I thought I had given it up. For 20 years, I convinced myself that part of my life was over. But tonight, standing here with all of you, I realized something important." He walked back to the piano and placed his hand gently on its surface. "Music isn't just about being perfect. It's not just about playing in fancy concert halls or impressing people. Music is about sharing something beautiful with others, about connecting with people in a way that words can't do." Victoria looked down at her phone, which was still recording. The video had been going for almost an hour now, and she realized That everything Robert had just told them was captured on camera. But instead of feeling excited about having content to post online, she felt sick. Tonight, when I played for you, I felt more like a musician than I have in 20 years, Robert continued. Not because my technique was perfect, but because I was sharing something real with people who needed to hear it. He looked directly at Victoria, and his expression was kind but serious. You asked me who I am. I'm someone who made mistakes, who lost his way, who spent too many years hiding from the world. But I'm also someone who never stopped loving music, even when it hurt to think about it. The room was completely silent except for the soft sound of Ashley crying. Robert's story had hit all of them harder than they had expected, and they were struggling to process what they had learned. Victoria finally found her voice. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I had no idea. I thought you were just just a janitor? Robert finished gently. I am a janitor. That's my job, and there's nothing wrong with honest work, but I'm also other things, we all are. The mistake isn't in having a humble job. The mistake is in thinking that a job defines a person's worth. He looked around at all the young faces staring at him. You're all talented, privileged young people with bright futures ahead of you. But talent and privilege come with responsibility. You have the power to lift people up or tear them down. Tonight you chose to tear someone down without knowing anything about them. Victoria's hands were shaking as she looked down at her phone. Without saying a word, she deleted the video she had been planning to post online. It felt like the least she could do. Mr. Williams, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Would you Would you maybe consider giving piano lessons? I mean, if you wanted to. I could talk to my grandmother about hiring you as an instructor. Robert looked surprised. You would do that? After everything that happened tonight? Victoria nodded, tears streaming down her face now. I've been playing piano for 13 years, but I've never heard anything as beautiful as what you just played. If you're willing to teach, I'd be honored to learn from you. One by one, the other students started speaking up, offering apologies, asking questions about his music, treating him with the respect they should have shown from the beginning. As Robert looked around at these young people who had been so cruel just an hour before, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years. It was hope. Maybe it wasn't too late for a second chance. Maybe his story wasn't over after all.